Why is youth ministry necessary? Why do we do it? So just take like 30 seconds, 45 seconds, think of your answer, and write that down. I'm not going to ask. This is going to be sort of strange. Now you're expecting me to say, now, what did you guys come up with? I'm not going to do that right now. We'll do that in a little bit. But what I do want to know is how many of you guys had a conversation where your answer and the person you were talking with had a slightly different answer? Just show of hands. Okay? Now that should tell us something, right? That however we see youth ministry, we see it in a little bit different light. That could be due to how we were raised inside of youth ministry. That could be due to how we were trained in youth ministry. That could also have to do with our context of youth ministry. It just depends on where we're coming from. And the one thing that I've learned, and I had to learn this the hard way, is I taught in Detroit for a little while, and then we picked up and moved all the way to Los Angeles, and we taught there for a little while. And I moved to Los Angeles thinking, they're kids. How different can they be? Wow! I was amazed. In fact, my first couple of months, it was almost like I was a new teacher all over again. I had no idea what I was dealing with. Midwestern kids and West Coast kids are astronomically different. And it was sort of funny because then by the time we got back to Chicago, the fads of the students that were dying in LA were just becoming cool in Chicago. I'm like, sweet, I'm cool a little bit longer. So here's how I describe it. We're going to talk more about some of this stuff in a little bit. So here's kind of how I see things. Okay? We have this gap. And this gap is the gap between the teen years and the years of adult, I hope I spell right. Spell, Steve, spell. Adulthood. And anybody that leads students in any way, okay, whether it's youth min or not, is trying to help students make this jump in one way or another. And, my kids will do something dumb. My oldest is 10. My kid, she'll do something really dumb. And as a parent, what's the first thing you ask your kid when they do something dumb? What were you thinking, right? Why'd you do that? And what do they say? I don't know. And you know what's funny? They don't know. They have no idea. In fact, I've now taught my 10-year-old, and she said this to me the other day. She did something. I said, do you know why you don't know what you're doing? And she looks at me, she goes, yeah, Dad, this isn't developed yet. Thank you, honey. She gets it because I've told her it like so many times. Like, this whole thing up here is not developed. The prefrontal cortex is not developed yet, which means they're making no decision, bad decisions. They think they're invincible. All of the stuff that teenagers do is driven by that. Now, there's a lot of other factors that we're going to talk about that got to come into play with that, but that's a big piece of it, right? So there's this awkward sort of bad decisions or no decisions, or I don't know how to do things, or I'm not sure of myself, my identity isn't secured yet, to, okay, should have those things figured out. And as youth ministers, what we're doing is we're trying to get them to understand their identity in Christ. Yeah. Right? We're trying to get them to see who they are in Christ, to see how it is that God has formed them, what special way that God has created them so they can go and impact the kingdom in the way that God has designed for them to go impact the kingdom. How has God uniquely crafted that student? And for us to stand in that gap and sometimes literally pull them along because they can't seem to get it right, that's our job. And it's a beautiful, beautiful burden. Right? It's so much fun when we get it right. I had a student a few months back that caught me on Facebook. It's like, thank you so much for all that you did. And I remember this thing you said and that thing you said. And I looked at my wife and I said, I don't remember her. But we live and we die with those success stories and the failures. I had another couple of students that were set to get married, and they asked me to marry them, and I was super excited. And I just got the text a couple of days ago that they called off the wedding. And it broke me because I was the one that sat them next to each other in class. I'm responsible for that relationship. Not really. So interestingly enough, we have been called to stand in that gap. And that gap that was formed, a lot of this had to do with early days of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s of students are doing things that are not healthy. Culture is impacting them in a way that's not healthy. We need to do something about it. And youth ministry started as more of a parachurch with Young Life. October 16th, 1941. I looked it up. I was curious as to when it actually started. And that was a long, long time ago. 1944 with Youth for Christ. 1970s was the start of the full-time youth pastor, where the churches recognized that, you know what, culture is so impacting, we need to give students a safe place to get them away from the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And literally, people were saying, instead of getting high on drugs, get high on Jesus. It was a way of providing students a different space, a different alternative. Instead of following one path, jump in with Jesus and follow a different one. And it worked. It worked really, really well. By the 1980s, we started kind of going along with this attractional model. The more culture became more entertainment valued, the more our youth ministry became more entertainment valued. And we started focusing on a youth ministry that was church-based, focused on edutainment, in other words, education by entertainment. If that's hard to conceptualize, think Schoolhouse Rock. That's edutainment, okay? And it works. In a lot of ways. As a teacher, we are taught to do that. Entertain your students, have fun with them, and they'll learn something. And oftentimes that's the case, and oftentimes that works. But what happens when we take entertainment too far, and it becomes almost entirely entertainment-based because we're just trying to get kids in the door, because culture is pulling them away. When there was, and we're going to go over this in a minute, but just think of the impact the digital world has on our kids and what that all means. I was working on something with understanding the digital world our kids live in, and we're talking with a pastor about this, and he said, you know, it's interesting that when video games first became popular and we first started playing them, it was, look what I can make this guy do, look what I can actually do with the video game, but you were still disconnected from it because it was you playing something else, and you didn't see yourself as these little bits or whatever, right? Now what is it?
First person.
It's first person. Look what I'm doing. And now you're wearing VR glasses and you're actually inside a whole new reality, right? It's cool, but now imagine an underdeveloped brain inside that world, trying to make judgments, trying to make decisions. It's a bad mix, okay? So that led us down a particular strategy. And so I worked for Awana for a couple years. Awana's formula, if you don't know, is really simple, okay? And Awana has youth ministry. While I was working there, I'd say I was the executive director of Awana Youth Ministry, and the first thing people would say to me was, Awana has youth ministry? Yes. Small groups, large groups, games. Now, I would say Art Rohrheim invented that, but I don't know if that's true or not. I was talking with the pastor of a very large church in the Chicago area, and I was trying to sell him on the idea that you need to use Awana's curriculum. And I didn't mean you need to have an Awana club, but you need to use the curriculum. We were developing curriculum with Sean McDowell. We were doing stuff with Greg Steer. We had all kinds of really cool stuff that we were making. And so I was trying to sell him on this. And he says, I just don't think the Awana model works for us. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Kind of knowing what they do because I was a part of the church community. And I said, so what do you do? He goes, well, we have a small group time and a large group time and a game time. So I said, Art Rohrheim invented that, right? And he said, who's Art Rohrheim? The guy who started Awana. And because what Art was doing in the 50s was he was watching kids line up to see a movie and line up to play games. And the church was largely empty. And the story goes is he was standing there watching that, and he was talking to a few people and said, I want kids to line up for church. And he started the game circle, the famous Awana game circle. And all the colors, and there's a whole story on how the colors became the colors, and I won't tell you all that, but it's really fun. It's kind of interesting. And this is what he basically did. A large group teaching, a small group meeting, and game time. And the game time was with the idea of entertaining the kids and giving them a space that they want to come to. And that worked, because you gave them a space they wanted to come to, because what was the alternative? Oh, having fun somewhere else. So I might as well have fun with some friends at church. That was fine. Now what's the alternative? Any number of things. So second question I have for you is, what methods are you using to reach students? Same thing, by yourself first. Think about it, write it down, or keep it in your head. If you're like me, you'll forget it 5 seconds later, but write it down. And then we'll talk about it in a second. All right. Show of hands. How many of you guys have a meeting at least once a week? How many of you guys play games of some kind? How many do small groups? How many do a large group teaching of some kind where you do a message or something? Anybody do anything wildly different that nobody else is doing? You're trying something completely new.
We also have food and snacks.
Food and snacks is also very important. I actually read an article the other day that said we should stop giving students like pizza and like those kinds of the typical youth ministry snacks for more healthy, and we should cater to the dairy-free, the gluten-free, the vegans, the paleos, the whatever else. Like, can you imagine the cost of trying to do that? I mean, I'm all for it because that's me, but can you imagine how terribly expensive that would be if you had to like have this spread of all of this, you know, we're going to go youth ministry paleo style.
Well, I had a student come in and he made the mistake of telling me that one of his favorite things about youth ministry was that he didn't have to be gluten-free. That he could come in and be like, Mom has made us a gluten-free home, and I'm like, you can't tell me that. So now I'm in trouble. But
Right. So you're coming to, now would that be considered sinning, right?
Right.
So now you're coming to youth ministry to, that's weird. Now, don't tell me, and don't, you know, you can share this later if you want, but I just want you to think about, and I wanted to bring this up to kind of raise the question of, do you feel like, and don't answer me, just think about it, do you feel like this, your way of doing youth ministry, the way you were brought up in it, the way you're currently doing it, the way you continue maybe to plan to do it, do you feel like it's effective? Do you feel, and now I don't mean that, do you feel like it's putting butts in the seats? Are you making disciples? Yeah. Are students growing in their faith? Are they getting out and sharing their faith? Are your students being impactful in their schools, in their communities, and perhaps a part-time job if they have one, and their teams that they, you know, that they play on, those kinds of places? Are they being the kind of people that Jesus desires them to be? Obviously not perfect, but are they making progress? Are you watching freshmen come into your group, or 6th graders, 7th graders, whatever it is, and are you watching them graduate, and you can sit back and go, yeah, they're going to be okay. They've got something. One of the things I got to do as a teacher was, one of my favorite things, but also one of the most terrifying things, was I got to stand on stage at graduation and read their verse as they walked across the stage. So I got to shake the hand or hug every single graduate for like 8-9 years. It was awesome. But it was terrifying because some of them, you read a verse and you're like, I don't know what's going to happen to them. You know, there were some that hadn't even graduated officially. We let them walk, but their grades weren't there yet and they couldn't do it. You know, just certain things about some of these kids, you're like, I don't know. But that fueled me. I don't know how you guys are, but that fueled me to say we need to make some changes on how we do things as a school. And that, it's a sobering reminder to say, when our kids graduate, we're kind of sending them off to say, okay, I'm not really responsible because I got all these kids coming behind. And with the power of social media, you find out as soon as these kids are married and having kids, they somehow jump back on Facebook, and because now there's something to post, and they're you're getting to see who's doing what. And you get to see, did they make it or not? Are they still growing? Are they actively plugged in to your church? One of my favorite things lately has been a girl who was a student of mine years ago. She's got to be in her mid-20s, late 20s by now. And we moved to Fort Wayne, and we found our church, and we're very first Sunday, we're checking our kids in. And I'm standing facing the kiosk for the kids, and there's too much stuff, it's overwhelming, it's all this stuff to take care of. And to get our kids checked in, making sure they're all comfortable, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I get tackled. I'm like, who the heck knows me here? And it's one of my former students who's now married, is helping run a business. Her husband is in like some high-level marketer. They're plugged into church. They're finishing membership, and she runs soccer camps and ministers to kids through soccer camps. I mean, it's just like but I didn't see any of that stuff. But just been talking to her, it's like, in fact, she was just watching the kids the other day while my wife was doing some stuff with our oldest. So we just start to see this growth from our students. But out of the thousands of students that I've taught, I can tell you 3 or 4 stories. That's it. I don't know the impact, and that's what makes it so difficult sometimes. But if we can change our methods, change how we do things, to at least get a better thought of I'm doing everything I can to make sure that I'm taking care of my end of the bargain. Obviously, the results are his, but I can do my hold up my end of the bargain. So we focus on games and small groups and teaching, special events, entertainments, our efforts to appear relevant, to try to bring kids in. But the reality is in the digital world, so many kids would rather sit in their room and watch YouTube videos than come to church. So what's the alternative? I don't need to go out into the world to interact with the world. I don't need to go out with my friends to interact with my friends. In fact, I would rather interact with them online than in person, which is a little strange for most of us to hear. I don't understand it at all. Even for someone as introverted as me, I don't really get that. So we have all this talk now of Generation Z. Now, I'm not going to go too much into it because when Sean gets here, he's going to dive into it much deeper, but he's a much better person to do that. But let me just give you some simple keys to Generation Z, some just general trends. And I try to stick to the general trends because let's face it, your ministry is your ministry and your kids are your kids. It could be totally different. A larger group's going to have a different dynamic than a smaller group. A group from Alaska is going to have a far different dynamic than a group from Pennsylvania, right? I mean, there's going to be a huge difference, and that's fine. So it's important to know your kids, but it's also important to kind of get some general ideas and because the same things are impacting all kids. How they respond to it could be a little bit different. Some cool things about them is they are more diverse, and they love diversity. That's a great thing. And they're used to it. Diversity for them is no big deal. They're taking less risk, which for some of us might go, what? That doesn't sound right. The statistics show that they are, largely. That doesn't mean that's the case for you or your ministry. They are incredibly focused on financial success. And there's some theories as to why that is. Based on economics of their parents, but their focus is they want to get a good job and they want to make a lot of money. Okay, but what are you willing to do to get there? They're not churched. I'm sure you've heard the whole rise of the nuns, and we're officially no longer a Christian nation, essentially. Those kinds of things. What's interesting is all those statistics of the late Gen X and the early millennials leaving the church, those statistics that were coming out, the 60 and 70 and 80%, whatever it was, it seemed like it was growing by 10% every year, which it wasn't, but that's what people talked about. All those people that walked away from church, guess what? They didn't go back. And now they're having kids. And that's what some of these kids are. Not all of them, but some of them. And it's going to be more and more. So as they're getting older, right? They're more stressed and they're more depressed than ever. It's bad. If you think it's bad, then multiply that. It's worse than you probably think because we don't see it. They're more tolerant. That could be good, that could be bad. But they're less happy, and they're completely overly connected. In fact, they're never disconnected. Even 10 years ago, I had to tell students to put their phones on a table during test time so they knew that their phone was there, so they wouldn't freak out and have to, because then they would get caught cheating because they would just be wanting to check their phone because it buzzed in their pocket. And the second they did that, I have to assume they're cheating. So I have to bust them. So it's like, well, you don't want me to catch you cheating, so put your phone on your desk so the anxiety won't bother you and get you in trouble, and you know that's where it is, and it can stay there. And actually, it helped. That was 10 years ago. So it's obviously much worse. And believe it or not, 10 years ago, not all my students had smartphones. Most did. In fact, my wife got crucified the other day at a Target because my 10-year-old doesn't have a phone yet.
Rightly so.
So then my 10-year-old comes to me, she goes, Daddy, why don't I have a phone? I said, do you need a phone? She goes, well, exactly. All right, so what is affecting this trend? So if you look at this, okay, so what I want you to see is these are some simple things. Now, it's really easy to look at this list and think, all right, these are the things that are going on with my kids. I'm not interested in this. This was cool maybe like a year and a half ago. What I'm more interested in is why. Why is this the case? More diverse, that's easy. Okay, less risk. Why are they taking less risk? Why are they focused on these things? Why are these the general trends? There's a lot, but I have a couple ideas. And what's happening? One, I think the Bible is being completely ignored. Yep. I think we are to a place where, because we're post-truth, post-Christian, the Western world has basically gone as far as just removing and forgetting about the influence and the relevancy of Scripture. Why? Because our morals are so fluid. Like, oh, whatever, I want to do what I want to do. I want to behave the way I want to behave. And I don't need something telling me otherwise. It's gotten me in trouble a few times, but I'll say it anyway, is I do believe that if somebody as great as Billy Graham got up and tried to do the exact same thing he did when he was in his heyday, it wouldn't work. Because how dare you tell me I'm a sinner? How dare I face the reality that I don't have it all figured out and that I need something more? How dare the Bible tell me that I've got things wrong and I need a Savior? I'll pick and choose what I want. Even in the Christian school world, I'm teaching from Scripture. I would have kids balk at me literally reading it and be like, that's offensive. Okay. Sorry. And I'd be like, guys, it's not me. It's Jesus. I mean, I literally was talking about John 14:6 once, and I was, saying, this is just what Jesus says. I'm the way, the truth, and the life, right? And this girl raises her hand and goes, I don't believe that. I think that's really offensive. I'm like, okay, well, it kind of is. I mean, she goes, how can you be so exclusive? I go, I'm not exclusive. Jesus is. Like, it's exclusive. It's not like you can't get into the club, but it's exclusive. There's one way to do this. Service is more social than gospel.
Yep.
Our kids love serving. I have never seen a kid, I'm sure there are some, but I've never seen a kid balk at serving or social justice in any way. They love it. I even have a former coworker of mine started an incredible nonprofit helping to get clean water in parts of Uganda. And she's a Christian, and nowhere in her ministry, I wouldn't call it a ministry, nowhere in her nonprofit is there a mention of the gospel. Well, clean water is great. The gospel's better. I think Jesus says something about living water somewhere in there. There's no shortage of giving, but there's a shortage of the gospel. We have lost the ability to connect our service with the gospel. We think just giving somebody something to eat is enough, and it's not. Sin is a moving target. We replace the doctrine of total depravity with a new doctrine of acceptance and affirmation of nearly any kind of behavior. Our students in public schools are being taught that people are inherently good. They're not. And it's something I want my children to know early. When my children are hurt by somebody else, You comfort them, you love them, you walk them through it, but I remind them all the time, people are not good and people are going to hurt you. I mean, just think of the world of college campuses, and this goes back to, just to run back to this real quick, when we talk about this idea of less risk, they're less happy, but they're more tolerant. We have this rise of safetyism within our college campuses, where people want to be safe from the influence of ideas. And I watched a video of a guy, I forget the guy's name, you probably know it, it's changed my mind.
Crowder.
Correct, thank you. And it was, I believe there are two genders, changed my mind. And because he would not recognize her, this girl he was talking to identified as gender non-binary, and she said, the fact that you're saying there are two genders is an act of violence toward me. And that's true. I've read that in several places of this is how people view it. It's an act of violence. So he says, he goes, well, isn't that a felony? Like, if I'm committing an act of violence against you, then I should probably go to jail. And she wasn't making that connection. But that's this idea of keep me safe from all the ideas and all the things that hurt me, okay? Which leads me to believe that there's actually something even deeper beneath the surface than just those few realities. That we have this rise of not just identity politics, but this idea of trying to figure out and trying to say basically who you need to be and who you are and how it all works. And I don't mean politics in the sense of actually politics, but this understanding of your identity can be fluid. You need to figure out who you are, gender identity issues, all of those kinds of things. We start to figure out, well, wait a minute, how is this working, okay? We talked about safetyism, the digital reality. Well, once where this idea of two different realities, where I could be in my physical reality, I could enter a digital reality. That was my world, dial-up internet, okay? Ask kids about a busy signal. And then, my wife's generation started to overlap a little bit, right? And now it's almost completely together. There's almost no distinction between the two. I mean, just think of social media profiles. Even in my wife's generation, we're actually two different generations. She's significantly younger than me. We had a friend over, one of her best friends was over for New Year's. And we set up this cool photo booth for the kids. So her kids and our kids are all over together. We had all these kids running around the house. It was great. And we set this fun little photo booth. My wife is one of those, she cuts out stuff and she'll take days to create something really cool and all this, she puts in way more effort than I'm ever willing to. And, but it always turns out great. And our kids are just having fun. The dog's jumping up in there and we're just making silly faces and having a good old time. And my wife says to her friend, come on, jump in. And she's, we need to use my camera. She's like, we got our phone on a tripod set so the kids can just hit the button as many times as they want and it's all good. She's like, no, I want to use my phone. My wife's like, why do you want to use your phone? Because it has a filter on it to make me look better. It's a photo booth for New Year's, come on. But she will not post anything on social media. She will not take a picture unless it has the right filters. That's what we've done. Now that's a 35-year-old woman. Now think about that in terms of students. It's that much worse, right? So we've got this incredible shift. And what I'm trying to get people to understand is we have this framework, okay? Now, depending on where you're at and how you were brought up, okay, we have a framework for ministry, okay, and how we understand it. Now, whether you realize it or not, you work within this framework, and you pretty much stay in the box. And that's okay. Because sometimes you get a break in the box and you kind of figure out how to get outside the framework a little bit. But it's gotten so different now that our kids are in a completely different framework. The digital world has created something in our kids that have completely changed the game. And I would argue many of us have forgotten to recognize that and say, wait a minute, how do I pull myself out of my own way of thinking to think in terms of my kids and my students so that I can best minister to them where they are? so I can meet them where they are. Get outside my frame of thinking and get into a new frame of thinking, which is what I want to do a little bit this morning. So I want you to think, we kind of already did this, so I'm going to skip over this pretty quickly, but I want you to think through a little bit, just what's working? What do you think is actually working for you? Okay, just take a second and just think about what's working in your ministry, okay? And hopefully it's something. It's the idea. Now, all of that to say, what if we were to reimagine youth ministry a little bit? And here's the conversation that I want to start, and we're going to pick up a little bit later on before lunch, okay? Is what if we were to reimagine youth ministry? What if we engaged our imaginations and began to reconsider how we can best help students navigate the gap and move closer to Christ? How can we be imaginative and get our students to experience something different? I'm going to talk more about this later, but there's research that's suggesting that earlier generations processed everything from a rational standpoint, from an intellectual standpoint, where we preached. Now, I remember this in seminary. We preached head, heart, hands. You get it intellectually, you get it in your heart, and then you go do something with it. There's research that's suggesting that's completely backwards. And it's actually hands, heart, head. The way our students are processing things is different than most of us. And we teach them one way. We stand up in front of them and say, this is what you should believe. Now go out and do something with it. As opposed to, let me show you what it looks like to believe this. And then I'm going to let you process this intellectually and get it, solidified in your head. Now, you don't have to agree with that, but there's research out there that's starting to suggest that. So I've got a couple of ideas. I'm just going to throw out some ideas, but I want you guys to use these as a launch pad for later on, okay? And some of these are not all my ideas. Most of these I stole from somebody, which is all good. Build community before middle school. I was talking with a pastor a few months back. They actually start their community groups in 5th grade. And my church does the same thing. Why? Anybody know? Why would that be a good idea? What's that?
They're leaving younger and younger from the church.
Yeah. Students are establishing their tribe at a younger age than they were previously. So that means we got to establish the tribe earlier.
They're more open.
Yeah, absolutely. My kids love going to church, not because it's church. Why? Their friends are at church. They love hanging out, and the Bible bucks they get some seriously cool stuff with their Bible bucks. So bring your Bible, do your God time throughout the week, and you get paid. It's amazing. The sooner we engage students in a community of committed believers and mentors, the better chance they have of staying and growing. Helping them experience their faith, just like I just said, is providing experiences. This is the shameless plug for CE Nashville. That's why we do what we do, because we provide experiences. That's what Momentum is all about. That's what Urban Hope is all about. It's providing an experience. Momentum is not your typical conference. I mean, if you guys have been there, you know, right? It's not a typical conference. It's not like every other conference. It's geared toward providing an experience to get them not just reset, but to even bring some people in. Reverse mentoring. I got this idea from a pastoral consultant for another denomination. Couldn't think of what it was. He goes, I actually have younger people mentoring me so that I understand the younger generations. And come to think of it, when I was teaching, I did the same thing. I just didn't call it that. I always had a few students that I could confide in when there was a cultural reference or student reference that I didn't get. So I always looked like I knew what I was talking about, and then afterward I'd be like, what was that? Like this weird sign, this comment, this acronym, whatever. I got to figure it out. It just took me a little while. But I had students to confide in that would share with me what was actually happening or what was actually happening within the student body. That was incredibly helpful. Don't be afraid of letting students mentor you. And honestly, and this is the part that we'll talk more through, and I'll let you guys do this in your groups later is reimagine how we do church. Just because it's what we've always done does not mean it's always going to work. You never do something because it's what you've always done. You do something because that's what works. And if it needs to change, it needs to change. And I know sometimes that's hard, but it's something to consider. So that's what, later on, we're going to talk more through this in a little bit, but you'll notice throughout the room pieces of paper on the wall with Sharpies. Later on, you're going to get into what I'm calling, and you see on your thing, whiteboard discussion groups. I'm a whiteboard freak. I have 4 of these in my office, and they're all full. That's how my brain works. But what it does, the idea is we're going to get into groups later, and you're going to process together the things that I'm talking about, the things that Bruce is talking about, the things that Chris is going to share a little bit later, and say, okay, how do we kind of talk this through? How do we have action steps? How do we work on this together so that when you walk out of here, you've got some actual things to try, things to do, not just, oh, this is a cool idea, and I'll have it till I get to about halfway home, and then I'm going to forget about it by the time we get to next youth group. You won't be able to sit down and think through it any longer, okay? Because your brain will just be toasted, okay? So it'll give you some, and then the mind trick that this plays is when you put these up on the wall and you see them, it becomes a constant reminder while we're here. And you can see what everybody else is doing too. And it might spark something else in you. Okay? And then the conversations can continue as long as they continue. But that's the idea. So this was just for me a conversation starter. I wanted to open it up, just getting us to think through what would it look like if we reimagined youth ministry? What would it look like if we just kicked our imaginations in gear and said, based on the current trends, based on what's happening with my students, based on what I see going on, what could I do to better reach my students?